Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about exporting data and graphics from DataGraph. We're going to start with some simple examples, and then we will move on to some more sophisticated examples of not just exporting one graph, but exporting multiple graphs at a time. And at the end, we're going to do a demo also of using the dgraph command from the command line, export graphics. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen. I guess I should just say, anyone who's joining for the first time, my name's Pamela Schultz, and we have David Adelsteinsons also on the line. So you've got the developer of DataGraph is also here with us. So David, thank you for joining. So exporting graphics and data from DataGraph. We're going to start actually with data, just a couple of simple examples, because this is something that we don't expect that people have to do all the time, but there, of course, are cases where there may be calculations or data that you have within DataGraph that you'd like to share with someone. So just to let people know how you do that, there's a file that I wanted to use here. That was a pretty basic one. So I'm in the example files, and I'm going to go ahead and open this file with the mean and standard deviation that's calculated for some data. And here I have, this is a pretty simple data set. I have two groups. I have a group of data that's being input into a command where it's also then calculating the summary statistics that you see here. And I could take all of this data and output it into a file that I could then share with others. And basically the way that DataGraph works is if you're not selecting anything on your data table and you go under the file menu, there is an option for exporting data. And if I click this, notice that, actually maybe I didn't make this entirely clear. Let me do that one more time. I'm going to the file menu, I go to export data, and there's a note there that says all visible columns. So what we're going to do is we're going to export everything that you see into a file, and I can pick a tab separated, comma separated, or an Excel document. And when I export that, if I want to put that onto my desktop, and we'll just leave it as an untitled CSV file. And now I should see this file somewhere on my desktop. Let me see, I'm not actually seeing where that's output. Might be behind let me move my stuff out of the way here. There it is. Sorry, in the moment, sometimes it's hard to see things that are right in front of your face. So I've got this CSV that I output, and it's just from the data table. And you can see that the calculated values are outputting all the digits that are there. And I can go ahead and then go back to my file just to illustrate a little bit more. If I only wanted to output the columns that you see here, I could select those and then say file, export data, and it gives you a clue here that you're only going to be exporting the columns that are selected. So if you didn't mean to select the columns, then you should go back and unselect them and redo. You can also output just specific columns. If for some reason I only wanted to output the columns C and D here, I could do that where I would say export data, select rows only. Again, it's kind of giving me a clue that I'm just exporting those rows. And then it will always include the header with that data that's exported. So there's really not too much more to show with that. We'll go on and talk now more about graphics, but just so you know that functionality is available. Okay, so in terms of exporting graphics, what I wanted to do first is talk just a little bit about the graphic formats that are available from DataGraph. And basically, and this is, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, but just so everyone is on the same page, there's two general types of graphic formats that we can output. And one type would be a vector-based output, and the other type would be a pixel-based output file. And just to illustrate the difference here, what I'm going to do is, let me make this, this graphic a little bit bigger so that you can see this. So here's my simple image, and I'm going to take a screenshot of this image. And when you take a screenshot, that is copying a pixel-based representation of the data. I can go ahead and just paste my screenshot right into DataGraph. If you've never used this before, there's an option for creating a new graph for composition, which doesn't have margins. It's the same settings as within DataGraph in terms of, you have the same layout settings, but it's just set up a certain way so you don't see those margins, and the margins are right at 0. Anyway, so if I want to paste in this image that I just copied, I'm going to do Command V, and it just pasted in my screenshot as a graphic command within DataGraph. And if I zoom in on this, you're going to start to see the pixels of the graph that I just brought in here. So clearly this is a pixel-based representation. Now within this graphic, I can actually go to the menu. So I'm just going ahead and I'm using a right click or a context click on my graph. And there's an option here for copy figure. And if I just go ahead and do that, and I'm going to make yet another graph for composition. So I have a blank sheet to work with here, blank canvas. If I paste that in and I zoom way in on this, increase the scale, you will not see that pixel-based or that pixel artifact in the image, because this is a vector based file format. So you see everything nice and crisp and clear, even when you zoom in on the image. And if I go back to the image that I started with, then when I clicked on the menu here, and you see again the shortcut for just copying that individual figure, then you'll notice there's other options here as well for copying PDF only, copying bitmap, copying a bitmap without a transparency. When you copy as a figure, or you choose that option, that's a way to allow DataGraph to copy the best possible format it can for you. So it actually copies both a pixel-based representation, it copies a vector-based representation, and it also copies the internal, there's a DataGraph representation, so that you're getting the best possible output when you paste this somewhere. So if I just go to copy figure, and I want to show you, if I go into Keynote, for example, and here's an image that I was testing this earlier to make sure that I had everything set up correctly. Here's a ternary diagram that I pasted in, and you'll notice that there's no white background associated with this. I'm just going to delete that one and paste in the image that I just copied. And that's one of the nice things about copying and pasting the image from DataGraph, is that it doesn't apply a background by default. And as a result, going into presentations like a Keynote file or a PowerPoint file, you can make some really nice slides because it will show through, have the transparency show through. So again, this is sort of the basic. I know some of you are probably familiar with, but just because I wanted to cover some of the basics in this, I don't really need that file. Okay. And I guess another important thing just to recognize for those of you who may not be as familiar with this, one of the important things is setting the size of the graph that we want to export. And the size here is something that we can set in units that are units of measure, like what we have here, 5 inches by 3 inches. You'll note that the automatic setting is when we just move with the size of the screen, and you'll see on the screen an actual representation of the pixel size that the graph has. And if any of you have not used this before, if you have a size that you like and you want to keep it, you can go to the gear menu, say fix current size, and then what it's doing is it's actually now, whoops, I zoomed in on the graph there. Let me zoom this back out. So now the size is fixed at that pixel representation. And I can change this if I would like. I could make this 400 pixels by 400. I could make this also, again, in units of measure, 10 centimeters by 8 centimeters. And that's really convenient, particularly for publishing, because then I can, when I export that into a document, for example, it will keep those sizes. Okay. And one of the things, I guess, we actually had a question recently that someone had on the help about understanding what the pixel representation means and how do you know how big a pixel is. And David, I don't know if you want to chime in here a little bit, but I guess the short answer would be that 72 pixels will be equal to an inch upon output. So if I have this set to 1 inch by 1 inch and I change it to 72 by 72, then those sizes would be exactly the same. And David, actually, I think it would be good or helpful if you wanted to comment a little. Yeah.
Yeah, I get sort of, this can get a little confusing, it seems, but there's basically two things. With the Retina screens, they separated what a point means and what a pixel means. So if a pixel is really a physical pixel on the screen, on a Retina screen, there's 2 pixels to what we would call a point. On a non-Retina screen, 1 pixel is 1 point, and 1 point corresponds to 1/72nd of an inch, and that's a typographical unit. So that is the conversion that gets applied to change something that is in screen points, which might be 2 pixels twice as many pixels really than points in each direction, screen points into printable dimension. And the dimension that gets on the PDF is the corresponding to the printable dimension. So if this is 300 by 300 and you save a PDF, that will be a 300 by 300 point PDF that will make a image that is 300 divided by 72, is a little bit which is actually surprisingly large, because it's over, don't ask me to do math here, but sort of 300 divided by 72 is a little bit more than 4. So that's a relatively sizable image compared to what you see on the screen. And if you switch the resolution to actual in there.
Oh, actual, yeah, sorry. Yeah, right up here.
That will use it so that it will scale it properly. So if you printed this out, saved it into a PDF, printed it out and compared it to the screen, this would be identical. You would see this image behind the printout. Now, when you want to save this to a bitmap, and you opened up can you open up the export where you can set the resolution of it?
Sure.
You're not already there. Sorry, I was setting up my own test. So
okay.
But that is when you have then a bitmap resolution. That is then, certainly bitmaps are just a bunch of pixels. And to map that pixel or resize it onto if you're printing that, you need to resize it to a certain point. And that gives you now how many pixels per inch. So 72 would be a pixel would be a typographical point, but typically you have it a lot more because you need at least 300 dots per inch or pixels per inch.
And actually on the help, there is on the knowledge base, there's a section on exporting that talks about different resolution sizes and what you might use for, depending on what your use case is. But to export a file exactly, that's where we would go under the file menu and go to the option of export graphics. So the simple one we've showed so far is just when you want to copy paste an image and you can bring it into another program, but export graphic will export whichever one that you have selected, and that's where you get these selectors that David was talking about, where you can choose between a vector graphic format and a pixel-based graphic format. And if you choose a PNG, for example, it's going to tell you or give you the option of specifying the resolution that you have.
That should technically be points per inch. It's DPI is dots per inch, but this is typically now called a PPI, or points per inch. And this would be 144 points per inch. That would be, or pixels per inch, that would be corresponding to a retina resolution on a laptop.
And David, do you want to comment at all on what the smoothing refers to, that option that you have there?
So often what you want, one thing you want to often do is to take a high resolution image and move it over to Photoshop for more pixel pixel manipulation. And by default on the screen, and if the smooth checkbox is there, it uses what is called anti-aliasing to smooth lines and kind of make, instead of having a sharp pixel boundary between a black and a white background, it adds grayscale values so that it fools your eye into thinking that it's smoother than it really is. Now, when you want to, that of course increases colors because it is adding colors in between, say, a blue fill or black line on the fill. Like here, it's adding colors. Is this a bitmap? If you zoom in.
This is a PNG. This is one that's output as a grayscale.
Yeah, so if you zoom in, well, sometimes
one. Yeah.
zoom in on the text, because the text has curved lines and not straight.
Oh yeah,
you can really see the grayscale values that are there, and that is just intended for your eye to get confused by it and move that make that feel smoother, right? And
so is it are you saying you export it without the smoothing and then you won't see that grayscale?
Then you will not see that grayscale. It will feel jaggy at a low resolution, but there is only black or white in the bitmap. So it's not going to have this gradient of colors in between. And that is often better when you want to post-process it, because then you output it in, say, 600 dpi or 1200 dpi, or like really a very high resolution. That will then be no aliasing done on the export from DataGraph. And of course, you can do aliasing after the fact later to kind of make it, just downsample it and smooth it and do other things. But it's going to be better at kind of having pixel accurate representation of every line. Then you turn off the smoothing, export it in a high resolution, and there will not use that blending method. So those will now have no space between them because they're mathematically exactly the same point. There's no.
And what would be an example of a high resolution? Would that be a 600 dpi or 1000?
1200. Let's say 1200, just to kind of keep a multiplicity of 300.
Okay.
And this would be high. So SEM high with no smoothing.
And that could be any of the formats that are.
Yeah, because PNG works very well when there's very few colors, so this will not be that large of a file. So how PNG uses the compression, it will index the color, so that's going to be a very small image. So if you save this out and just sort of see what happens, unclick the grayscale. There's no reason to have that.
Oh yeah.
And you're not going to override over it at the moment, but.
This would be a high resolution.
Yeah. And just if you open that again in preview, start zooming in on the text.
Okay.
Or like there's a text on the axis, zoom in there. So that is a lot higher. Yeah. So when you then sample that, when you work in high resolution and then you're going to cast it into a low resolution, like a retina screen or something like that, and then those pixels will be sampled in a way that they will make that grayscale sample, right? So that, but the screen is kind of faking that, like how the screen renders it fakes that. It doesn't render it in high resolution and then downsamples it, the whole image. It sort of does that on a shape by shape basis, which is why you get that little bleed through in some cases. but I definitely try to avoid that when possible. So sort of, but without changing coordinates, because I don't want to have that be coordinate sort of data inaccurate.
So the other thing that I wanted to just comment on is the alpha, for those of you who might not be familiar with what an alpha channel is. The alpha channel is something that allows for the transparency, and that's why when I brought it into Keynote, you could see the background through the image itself. And you have that option as well when you go into export graphic for all of the bitmap based images. There's the option of with and without the alpha channel.
But except for JPEG. JPEG does not support transparency.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then David, you and I were talking the other day about the PDF transparencies. Can you comment on that a little bit, I guess?
Yeah, so PDF, if viewed as a printable format, right? I mean, EPS definitely was set up for printers in the back, like printers, and printers do not have any transparency. Like they will just draw layer by layer sort of into a buffer, no transparency whatsoever. We're not thinking of that. So EPS does not support transparency. PDF is sort of a newer version of EPS. So I think in a previous version, so if you have a transparency, let's just change the transparency on one of them.
So for example, I guess if I make a background.
Or you change the color of those bars to be slightly transparent.
Would that?
Or that. So if you want to go into and export this as an EPS.
As an EPS?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Warning, transparency will be removed because there's no transparency allowed in the EPS format. So what will happen, it will basically render it on top of a white background. So if the transparency is above your text, the text will not be displayed because that will be, but it will look okay here because the background was really the background of the image. So it converted it automatically into, actually because the EPS doesn't even have a gradient data structure, it created a bitmap, high resolution bitmap for the background. But that was completely opaque background. So you sort of see it mostly if you have something where like the color, the bars were transparent because they're being drawn over content.
So if this were a transparent color.
Yeah, then, and it's hard to tell really.
Yeah.
I won't, there will be a subtle difference from that. So it's trying to, it doesn't fail, it converts images into it, and it will convert this guy into a opaque color, assuming a white background. So it's going to look close at the top because that is similar to a white background, but at the bottom, it will look lighter because it is drawing it sort of blends it with a white background rather than a deeper purple background.
And I guess the message is for users of the program, if you're outputting transparencies and you're outputting to these formats, you could have some differences in colors. That's
EPS. Now PDF does allow some things to be transparent and others not. For example, it doesn't, I don't think, last I checked, it does not allow transparency in gradients, but it does allow transparency in fill color. And the printer driver will just handle that by rendering into an off-screen buffer. But so those are kind of avoiding, because what used to happen is that if you're printing, and this might be that different now, but what used to happen was sort of annoying was that, yes, PDF allowed transparency, but when you printed onto printers, it made it into a bitmap, and the bitmap was low resolution. So when you were printing it out, it looked crappy because it was printing out a lower resolution than the printer could really handle. So I think I might have taken that warning out because people really aren't, and warning and conversion out for the PDF. because people really aren't using PDFs that much for printing as much as like
For viewing on the screen.
so.
Yeah.
But that's kind of where the warning is. So there's like based on the if you open up the but go on to the export right again
Yeah.
because sort
Yeah.
of
I wanted to demo some more.
yeah, but oh, just a last point, and then I will like this about there are several file formats, and it's important to kind of there's two that we haven't talked about. One is very important, and one is very kind of unique to DataGraph, and that is there's the EPS and the PDF, and you know that SVG will be lossless in this case because SVG allows a lot of these transparencies and gradients and so forth. So that will be a scalable vector graphic is what it stands for, and that is often used for websites, and also tools like Illustrator will be able to read that. So you can export it as an SVG rather than a PDF. And then Illustrator can read in the SVG graph, and it might be less lossy in terms of settings and so forth than the PDF. Now, DTG is a data tank graphic, but that really is my own serialization of the graphic format. The only one that reads the DT graphic are my own tools, so it would really only be for importing a file back into DataGraph or Image Tank. But that is what DTG is. But those are all kind of vector mathematical representations and they have full resolution, like the full kind of accuracy of what the font is, what is the font style, what is the font size, rather than rendered into a pixel. Okay, now off you go.
Great, no, great. So, so what I wanted to do was just point out a couple of other options in terms of exporting files. I know there's a question on doing a panel graph, but let me just show you first that what we selected here was to export graphic, which was an individual graphic. If you want to export multiple graphs at a time, you have an option for flagging graphs. If you go to the thumbnail of your graph and you click the top right-hand corner, you'll be able to add a little flag to the thumbnail itself. And then when you go under export or go into the file menu, you'll now see this option for export flagged graphs. So that will export for you every graph that you have flagged, and it is one way that you can export multiple graphs. I'm going to show you another way as we go through the webinar, but I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. And again, if you want to unflag them, that's fine. The graphics themselves they'll have the name of the graph that you give when you export the flagged graph. So again, in case you just haven't really done this before, I can click on my thumbnail and I can name my graph, and then it will be the name that it will be used when it's exported. Okay, so just quickly, one of the questions was, what is the best strategy for creating and exporting a multi-panel figure, for example, a 2x2? And this is a question that actually comes up quite a bit in terms of how do you panel graphs. I know it's something that people often like to do. And in DataGraph, there are, it sort of depends on how you want to, or your approach that you're using, and are you using it for creating multiple graphs that have the same axes, or are you pulling together different graphics that have the same axes? So for example, if you go into the online examples and I started typing in multiple figures, you can see here, this is an example with multiple figures that are stacked together. And if I open this file, this is an example where the individual figures have been created as separate graphs, and then they're pulled together in this graph style that we call this composition graph. So I can take these individual images, and again, this new graph for composition creates a completely blank canvas. And when you do that, you get also one command in that graphic, and this is called the graphic command. The shortcut to creating a graphic command is up in the thumbnails as well. But what this does is it's just showing you this interface where you can either import an actual image that's not in DataGraph into this canvas, or I can say the source here is another graph, and I can pick one of the graphs that I've already created. I can pick where I want to anchor that graph to. And then once you've done this, you can go ahead and, I often just make copies of these and then pick a different graph here, anchor it onto another corner. And then I would also want to set the size appropriate for my graph. So these graphs here are individually 4 inches wide. So my composite of this, if I'm not going to scale these, would then be 8 inches wide. And I could then compose those together into one graph that I could output. The other way to do this is using split axes. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because I want to make sure we have time for the other topics. But just quickly, for any graph that you create in DataGraph, you can click split X or split Y. And when you do that, notice that you actually get a visual interface that shows you what panel that individual command is drawing, whatever it's responsible for drawing. And you can individually move commands between graphs. I don't know how well you can see that here. Let me make this a little bit bigger. But again, I can use this visual interface to move where things are located. Another thing that's handy here is that if I place these two graphs that I want together into a group, so I highlighted the commands, I clicked the group icon, then on the group gear menu, now that you have these panels, you can move all the commands within that group to a different axis. And it will show you both the y-axis that you have as well as the x-axis. So it makes it really convenient for having something like this where you want to have multiple graphs on the same, within a panel like that. Now this will share the x-axis and the y-axis for these graphs. There are ways to scale the data. There's actually an example in the online examples that shows you how to do that. But again, in the interest of making sure I get through everything, I won't go into that detail, but hopefully that at least gets you great, gets you going. So it looks like that helped to answer that question. And there was, just quickly, there was a question about will there be other webinars, and we definitely going to continue to do this. The webinar is going to take a little bit of a vacation during July for the Friday webinar, but we will definitely be back in August, and we'll be doing these, continuing these on a regular basis. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback from this, so we're really happy about that. Okay, so now the next thing that I wanted to do is to talk a little bit more about doing larger exports of graphs, and let me see, let me make sure I've got my punch list here. So the things we've done so far is, right, we've talked about just how to copy and paste an individual figure, how you can export any of your individual graphs or flagged graphs to figures. But there's a functionality that we added that allows you to export a whole series of figures that was added. I don't know, maybe, I don't know if this was in the last version or maybe 2 versions ago, but this is really a neat functionality. So I have an example here to illustrate this that is a set of data on COVID data for the US that has 2 graphs in this. And both of these graphs are set up so that they're dependent upon this particular text variable. And notice how if I change this text variable and select a different state, I am going to also change the data that's in these individual graphs. the way that this is created, just so you can see this from scratch, I'd actually like to just go ahead and I can do a new file, and actually in the interest of time, I'll just, sorry, moving this around a little bit, just drag and drop this this data in here. So I have this data table that has a date column, has states, and has also a FIPS code associated with each state, has number of cases and number of deaths. So if I wanted to do this bar graph, for example, with a particular state, I could start with a pivot graph. But what this is doing by default is this is showing me all the data for all of the states. So if I want to just show, show one state, first of all, I want to change how this is mapped. By default, this will map the date into individual years. If I want weeks, for example, or maybe I want even days, I can see that, but it's going to be a lot of bars because I have every state in here. And you can see that even within the preview here, that every state is shown. Another thing, just in case you haven't done this before, if I have a date column on my x-axis, I probably want to show this numerically, so I can uncheck the category box, which is the way that the default is for the pivot command. But now I want to mask this to just show an individual state. I'm going to do this at the group level, and I'm going to have a mask based on the state, and I can say that I want this to be when the state column has the text, select text is, and I don't have a menu yet in this file, so it doesn't say anything, but go ahead and select create text menu. Now I have this drop-down menu at the left-hand side that I can go ahead and pick what state I would like to show. And because we want to actually show that also on our graph, I could go ahead and use what we refer to as a token to connect to this variable to be able to show that within my graph. So first, let me just change the name of this to something a little more meaningful. Just pick state, for example. And if I go to my title of my graph and click over to the right-hand side, it will show me a list of variables. I can choose pick state, hit enter. Now I'm going to see the state that this data is associated with. And again, when I change this now, it's going to change both the data and the title that I see here. Now what I want to do is I want to actually export a graph for every single state that is in my list. And to do that, there is a gear menu on the variable itself, and it has an option for export current figure for all labels. And when I select that, it brings up the file menu, so I can select where I want to output this to. I created beforehand a blank folder that I could just output this into. I'm going to go ahead and click open. And now when I go to this folder, actually let me just open this up. There we go. So now I have, oops. Try this one more time here. There we go. Now I have this folder that shows me a graphic for every image for every state.
And the reason it's EPS is because it uses the last setting on your export. So
that's a good point.
An option, like if you go again into the export, it's sort of threatening to export it again.
Yep, let me do that. Export current figure for all.
It's by default closed, but there's an options button there in the bottom left, which gives you the same options, but the name already is picked, so you can export this with the same options that you have in the other ones.
Yeah, great, good point. So I could go ahead and do this as a PNG or a TIFF and do the same setting.
And it uses the resolution, so you're going to save everything in 1200 dpi. You might need to change that, but yeah.
Yeah, 300 is probably, actually 144 would be Retina, so that would be fine. Now, the other thing that I want to show you here is that just one more thing with this text menu. I'll go ahead and bring up the file that I had created before before a meeting. So this is the same data. I guess I don't have the titles in here, but you can see this is the same data. And I have not only a bar graph here, but I also have a line graph that's using the same approach where it's masking based on this text variable. And if I change this variable, it's going to change my data that I see. Now, now that I have two graphs that both depend on this variable, when you click on the gear menu, you'll see another option. I can export my current figure, meaning the figure that I have highlighted. This would currently, for me, be this lines graph. I can export that for all the for all the options, all the labels that I've selected, or I could export all figures that depend on this particular graph. So if I selected export all figures, it would export what I have labeled as figure 1 and figure 2 into whatever file I selected. One of the things that was a comment on this functionality that we got recently was that the names of the files, when you export from multiple figures, we were putting in a preface of figure 1, figure 2, and then using whatever the criteria was that is used for filtering the data as the name. We're changing that in the next version that we release. So if you have a name for the figure set up, it will take that name and append the filtering criteria to the end of that. So for example, here I would have figure 1 underscore, and then a figure would be created for all of the states with the name of the state following that. And there's a question on making the ternary plot in DataGraph, which would be a nice thing to show. We get a lot of questions about ternary graphs, and I know this is something people are interested in. So I'm going to show you one really quick thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to David. If you go into the online examples, then we actually just added this new ternary diagram template. There are two ternary diagram templates in here. There's an older one that if you type in ternary graph, you'll find this older one here too. Both of these are created by taking the data in an XY coordinates, or taking data that's in a 3-component system and scaling it into the XY coordinate system. One of the things we added recently was the ability to use this redirect column. This is under the other drop-down menu. This is one of the options, redirect, where it's a way to alias a particular column. So in this ternary diagram that we recently created, it's really easy to change this. If you have 3 columns of data, just take them, copy and paste them in, and then it will update the diagram for you. So it'd be great to play with that. We're trying to make these as easy as possible for you, so you can create diagrams like this. And we've been, and we will continue to update some of the templates to make good use of this redirect column, because the benefit is that then you have a group that has your input data that you see here, and a group that has the data that's being processed, and we can really separate the two out. So it makes it a lot easier to see what is the input data versus the calculations that are being done. Okay, so with that, I wanted to turn it over to David.
For people that use the terminal and scripting, and this could also be scripting from Python, they want to be able to use DataGraph to create graphics based on their text. They're based on their data. So the way that this is implemented is there is a command, really, if you look at a DataGraph document, the way that it's set up is you really are creating a pipeline to take the data into a graphic. Everything is kind of like pushing you or funneling you into that way of thinking. And once you have that, you really have a this is what is typically referred to as a data flow environment. So the data flows from your starting point in through kind of the processes. And what the dgraph utility allows you to do is to use a DataGraph file as a script file, essentially. So the still sort of, and
I hate to say I'm having trouble getting this to show me the.
and you can't make me a co-host, right? Anyone that has experience with Zoom, which I think right, can maybe pipe up, but is there managed? Okay, so here is let me do one thing.
Want to try and take over my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I apologize to everyone. Normally there is a participants window that I can see that I should be able to allow someone else to take over the screen, but I'm not, Zoom is not showing me that right now. And I really don't know why. There's a share screen setting that is not quite bringing up what I'm looking to do.
Okay, so share your screen now.
Okay. Oh, hang on. Oh, you got it?
So I have to minimize your screen or my screen. So here, if I'm gonna focus on this screen here. So I think, no, wrong screen, sorry.
We'll get better at this.
Okay, so let me just first see if I can move you. So then the terminal. So if you open up the terminal, you can see here, and let's see if you have a bin directory. You have a bin directory here, and there's nothing in it. So normally there's a bin directory that I guess I created a while ago on your screen, but on your machine. But the dgraph utility, there's two ways of getting it. If you have downloaded the worst version of our website, it is already inside the DataGraph packet. If you haven't, you have to go to the link, I believe it is, so the standard data, like the URL, and then data
for people with
Mac App Store version, and then you have dgraph just as a you have like this is the standard preamble here from the web visualdatatools.com/datagraph, and then dgraph, that is the binary executable. And we will have some better description of like how to work around how to set up, and because the Mac App Store version is sandboxed, and there's a way to allow, and command line utilities in the sandbox are a little tricky. So this is why it took a while to get dgraph to work in the Mac App Store version. But there is a way to kind of enable dgraph to access particular directories, and you do that within the preferences setting in the Mac App Store version. So anyway, since this is not the Mac App Store version, we'll run this without it. So the normal one is, say, I'll just copy it. Copy from the applications DataGraph content library dgraph. This is where it is inside of the normal, like the version from the website. Apple does not allow me to have a command line utility inside the package in the Mac App Store version. So I'm just going to copy it into the binary file. This one here is a very small, ls-l inside the binary. You can see that this is a very small file because it really is just a bootstrapper to call DataGraph itself. Let me just create a very quick one here. So inside DataGraph, I will add like 3 columns, A and a B and a C, and I will do some simple kind of data set here, just as a way to set up something, right? So here's setting up and this is that file, or maybe I'll do a lines command here so that this at these X, I'm gonna do lines here just to kind of draw lines at where I am, right? So this is a simple file, and I'm gonna save this into the temp directory as a test.dgraph. So this is the file, DataGraph file itself. It takes these columns and sort of draws A and B into that graph. Text edit, this might open up all kinds of files in yours, but okay, no, it doesn't. Let me just create a simple file. Let's call it sort of first tab, second tab, third, and new line for like 1, 2, oh, this is 1, and I'm only going to use the first 2, and there's 3 and 2. Just some data set here. I'm going to make it into, and this is, I'm going to make it into, it is also a raw text document. I'm going to save it into the temp directory and test.text. Right? So if I'm now in the terminal here, oh, where's the terminal? I need to basically should full screen those. Where's your dock?
It's on the other screen. Well, I think I can get the terminal for you.
Yeah, there it is. So if you look at here, what I have inside this directory, there's the test.dgraph, there's the test.text. Let me close this file here and do bin dgraph. Oh, I guess I copied it in the, I thought I had copied it into your directory. So let's just copy it here. CD, copy applications, DataGraph, content, contents, library, dgraph. I'll just copy it into your bin directory. So in here, bin dgraph, right? This is the utility of it. If you just run that like without any arguments, it says you need to specify the inputs. You can also specify like -help to get a command line help for it. You can, but the basic syntax is you have this, is you have to type in the DataGraph file, and you have to type in the file that the data itself. And when you do that, let's say that I did that without any arguments, it is understood to be opens up the dgraph file, imports the text.txt over the variables, the columns that are visible here. And then but because you didn't specify an output argument, it will just open up that file. So if you're trying to figure out why things are not working, this is a very helpful thing to have. But normally, once things are working, what you do then is you just add in a third argument, which is out.say.png, and that sort of runs this, but because it has something to output into, it will create that file and quit. So if you then open the out.png, and this will open it up in the preview, right? You will see that this is the PNG file that you have, like the output file as PNG. And if you go back into the terminal and say, and now this is the, oh, I have to go into the text editor again because I want to modify this file, and I'm going to add like a 4, 5, and then I'll just add something for the fun of it, and 5 and 2, save that. And if I run this file again and I need to, I think, close this one because otherwise it's open out.png. You can see this is the new file. Now, if you leave out the output file, and that can be output.pdf, .eps, svg, all of those. It will just depend on what the ending is. Now, you can see here that this is written first and second and third. The names of the columns have been overwritten by the import. And if you look at the file that I wrote, that is just an ABC. Now, if you want to have an expression in this, if you take, for example, here and say like scale, and this is a times 3, now this will work properly here, but when you import it, a is going to change into first, and then this expression here will not work because a is no longer in existence. So that's where you would use the redirect column, where you say, I want, say, my B column to be this, and this is value, right? Or sort of scale this, and then you can have this as scale this times 4. And if you take this is the b-axis, so if you then take a here and then scaled and draw like a line to those scaled versions, save this, and then go back into the terminal and run, let's say first just run it without an output just to see what happens to it. Then you can see here that this one is scale in the scale this, and scale is the column. So this is not by name, but by object reference. So that's why that is robust with respect to change, and it will still work. If you had the column here and took, instead of this, would be b times that would work over here, but save this, go back into the terminal, go in here, and then this is missing because b is missing, so this is not going to work. So that is kind of a quick way, and we're sort of out of time, I think, but I mean that is typically how you can do this, and it always exports the graph that is currently selected. So you could have this script be very complicated. And the other thing that you need to do, really should do, is it will only import over things that are visible. So for example, if you import, like it's not going to import over a column that is computed. So that's okay. But often you just make sure that the only things that are visible here are the ones that you will import over, and the rest is just a pipeline. So that way you can, in your program, you can set this into a shell script, for example, where you download some text file, then this will be imported out. The import is going to be exactly the same as if you went here, imported like nothing selected, import file here and select the file. This is basically what it replicates. And then the export is what you replicates when you go into export graphics.
Great.
DataGraph does not have to be running in order to do this. Since it is running, it will do it in the background. But if it's not running, it's not going to launch it. It's going to just start a non-graphically or non-GUI version of it. So you can use this in a shell script, even if you're not logged into the machine, or you're logged into the machine, but you're logging into it non-graphically.
Great. Cool. I guess I just wanted to very quickly comment on, there was a question about having a similar function with the export figure that would actually combine all of the figures in multiple panels. I guess we'd have to think about how to do that.
like a contact sheet of sorts?
Yeah, making sort of a contact sheet could be a possibility. So if you wanted to, I guess, I don't know, David, if you have any thoughts off the top of your head, if you thought of doing something like a contact sheet in the past, or?
No, I have not done that. I'm now reading, and will there be Python bindings to DataGraph? So so there's two solutions to this. Like, one is in Python, you can run a shell script. So you can you can ask the Python to launch something in the shell. And there you can compose the dgraph command with the names and so forth. So people have done that. There is another utility, but this is very much in the beta, that allows you to run, let me see, where's the...
Oh, sorry, I was moving things around.
I'm sort of, no, I'm in the wrong application. I'm in the Zoom application, and I should be in the screen sharing application. So there is, and I think the terminal is, here's the terminal. So I don't know if you have the beta or not, but so applications, DataGraph, content, and content library. So if you...
I believe I'm not running the beta right now.
Well, it's sort of in there, but there's a dgraph and what that does is a little bit strange. So it's sort of, if you do this, it establishes a connection to DataGraph that is running currently. Now, I typed in something and it pops up a debugging window for it. So this is the streaming interface for DataGraph. And you can create here, so the syntax was new file. And that creates a new file. Or you can also open a file. You can sort of see here in here, it gives you kind of, there's a new file. Well, this is kind of the log of what happens. These are the things that you can do at this point. So you can I created a new file here. And so this is the new file here. I think there's an open file also. And undefined command. So it's sort of, this is definitely in the beta, but the point of that is that sort of you can add in scripts to this. So you can set up, if you want to pipe, because in the Python bindings, or Python way of calling it, it's the shell script, you have to have prepared all the files and saved into this file on disk to be able to then open it up as you would do in the terminal. If you want to do it more dynamic and more control over it, the dgraphconnect is a live hook into the existing DataGraph file. For safety purposes, you cannot connect to an existing file that is already open, because I don't want to be able to snoop into a file that someone has. But you can open a file, but once you have opened a file, then you can modify it to your content, because that's not a file that's something that is clear that was opened by. So that gives you more options, but it's definitely a beta thing in it. And if you are interested in exploring that, let me know, and we can work through kind of what commands do you need and sort of figuring this out. This is the only help really is kind of this debugging window to kind of see what your state is. You clearly have a file, which is this file. You're opening a graph that is this graph here. You can also zoom, you can add you're doing it here, new plot, and that adds a new plot, and now you're in a certain command. And in the command, you can see these are the settings you have in that command. This is, you can add in, you can select things that sort of, you can build those in, but you should really open up a file that sort of gives you most things already and then tweaking it. And you can override data, you can override column by reference, particular values and so forth in it. So that's a lot more complicated, but that's another way of kind of data like Python type bindings, because these are commands that you can call into it, but you're not running data, you're not calling Python from DataGraph or launching DataGraph from you're not, doesn't become a kind of a functional, like a Python object inside your script. Yeah.
Okay, great. I guess just the last thing here would be that we have been putting our webinars onto our YouTube channel. So you can go to youtube.com/DataGraph, and we have a channel there for anyone who is interested in looking at the recordings of these. And we have 2 of them up so far from June. We also have some webinars that we did on COVID data sets that are also posted there, and we will continue to post them on the YouTube channel. So it'd be great if you want to follow us there, and as well as other videos that we have posted there, other demos. Besides that, we'll go ahead and sign off, and we'll continue to work on our technical connections here so we get this working as best we can. Again, the webinars are going to go on a little vacation in July, but we will be back in August. And any suggestions you have actually for webinars, feel free to send them along and email them or post them on the forum if you have anything you want to share. Other than that, I hope that this was useful and you learned some things from today's webinar. And I hope that you also have a great weekend. Thanks, everyone. I'll go ahead and end the webinar now.
Thank you.